In the year 1848, a young man named Phineas Gage, who worked as a railroad foreman, experienced a terrible accident. Gage was tamping down explosive powder in a drilled hole using a tamping iron, and due to a misstep, the powder had not been covered with sand, and a spark ignited the explosive, launching the tamping iron upward. The rod entered his left cheek, passed behind his left eye, and exited through the top of his skull, destroying a significant portion of his frontal lobe. Miraculously, Gage survived the accident and was conscious within minutes. He was treated and recovered physically within a few months. However, his personality changed drastically. Once calm, organized, and polite, Gage became impulsive, aggressive, unreliable, and socially inappropriate. Friends and co-workers said he was no longer the Gage they once knew. Phineas Gage's case became a cornerstone in the field of neuroscience, as it was the first real evidence that damage to specific areas of the brain, particularly the frontal lobe, could profoundly affect personality and behavior. That story is a clear example of how a terrible accident, which can cause profound trauma to a person's brain, can radically change them and make them the complete opposite of who they used to be. And using that case as an example, what if a very important historical figure in our history had also suffered an accident similar to Phineas Gage? What if Justinian the Great, during his youth before ascending to Emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire and trying to reconquer the Western Roman Empire, had an accident that would completely change his personality, character, and attitude, but without altering his level of intelligence and ability to be a great emperor? What if that brutal accident with massive brain damage had caused Justinian to reject Christianity? And therefore, what if the Byzantine Empire rejected Christianity? That's the alternate scenario we are going to look at today. In this timeline, Justinian, better known as Flavius Petrus Sabatius during his youth, who came from humble origins, living poorly in a small town between the border of North Macedonia and present-day Serbia, would experience a terrible accident as a child or a teenager, which he would survive, but with terrible consequences that in the long term would completely change his personality and opinions. After that accident, the future Justinian would have spent several days or even several weeks in a coma, and it was during that coma that he would experience multiple dreams and hallucinations caused by the brain damage due to his accident. And it would be during one of those feverish dreams that Justinian would experience a vision that would mark the rest of his life in this timeline. It would be a vision in which Zeus, the king of the pagan gods of his ancestors, would come in his dreams to entrust him with the task of saving the Roman Empire, restoring its former greatness along with its ideals that made them great. And with that, also save the Roman people and their culture from obscurantism and Christian indoctrination, which was destroying all fighting spirit and vigor of the Romans that made them so feared by their enemies in the past. And consequently, restore the pragmatism and rationality of the Roman mentality, which will allow them to adapt to any obstacle in order to overcome it and be victorious as in the old days. Once Justinian had recovered and awakened from that feverish dream, his perspective on everything in life, especially his Christian faith, would have changed radically. However, even though his personality and religious beliefs would have changed completely, his prodigious intelligence and adaptability that he would show in the future would remain intact, fully understanding that this radical change in his faith and beliefs could not be known by anyone for now if he wanted to continue having the favors of his uncle Justin, who hoped that one day he would become the next Roman emperor, and in turn adopt Justinian in order to make him the next emperor after him. Thus, Justinian would hide his secret of no longer being a follower of Christ for much of his entire life before ascending to emperor, at least for the most part. In our timeline, his uncle Justin brought Justinian to Constantinople as soon as he could to give him the best education possible, and eventually make him his successor as Roman emperor, but here Justinian would take a more proactive role in the decisions and choices of his studies, taking advantage of his uncle's growing influence to allow him to travel all over the empire during his formative years, and study in the best academies he could find, wanting to know more about the history of his culture and the pagan myths of his ancestors. You might think that would be crazy, that at that point in history, absolutely everyone in the Eastern Roman Empire was Christian, and that absolutely nowhere could we continue to study pagan philosophies and mythologies that predate Christianity. But that is only a half-truth. During the early Middle Ages, although in theory the entire Eastern Roman Empire and the new Germanic kingdoms that replaced the Western Roman Empire had already converted to Christianity, in practice the institutional domination of Christianity was still very theoretical, especially outside the big cities, and for a long time the population of those territories remained culturally more pagan than Christian, except that now they were forced to believe in one God, but it was definitely not a genuine conviction of each individual as it would be in several centuries later in the Middle Ages, where the Christian belief would be absolute and genuine among the entire population of Europe. Between the times of the fall of the Western Roman Empire and the rise to power of Justinian as Eastern Emperor, many strong and courageous personalities still tried to maintain the pagan and Neoplatonic legacy of antiquity, with some even having the nerve and balls to publicly claim to still be pagans. The excellent content creator MAIORIANUS, whose work I greatly appreciate, made many videos talking about how paganism survived during the early Middle Ages through various institutions and personalities of the time, which I invite you to go watch to get more context about the situation of paganism at that time, which was not as dead and extinct as it might seem, and Christian dominance was not yet absolute. I'll leave some of his videos that talk about the topic of paganism in late antiquity or the early Middle Ages in the description. So, Justinian would spend much of his youth traveling throughout the Eastern Roman Empire, studying at various academies and institutions where they learned about ancient Greek mythology and Neoplatonic philosophy, with Justinian in our timeline being actually responsible for closing the last Neoplatonic academy during his reign. His travels and visits to these pagan-influenced places would be extremely secretive, with Justinian often adopting a false identity so as not to harm his uncle's reputation in Constantinople. But his travels would not only have the purpose of acquiring new philosophical, mythological, or cultural knowledge of the Greco-Roman pagan history, but also little by little to secretly gather those groups of people who were still secretly pagans so that they would join his cause in the future, the cause of freeing the Romans from Christian dogmatism and tyranny, allowing everyone to live freely again, practicing their beliefs and religions without any consequences or punishment. By revealing his true identity to these secret pagan groups, they would know of his future rise to power as Emperor of the Romans, and due to that many would join Justinian, seeing him as the hope that the rural people of the Roman world had been waiting for many generations, in addition to multiple promises of monetary rewards and lands to offer, or taxes exemptions, which would create enormous loyalty among a large population of secret pagans, who would not hesitate at the given moment to send their children or themselves into battle in the event of a coup d'etat or civil war in order to end Christian dominance. Eventually, after traveling throughout the empire for years and meeting his future wife Theodora, Justinian would finally enter Constantinople to become the right-hand man of his uncle Justin, Emperor of the Romans at the time. His first test as a competent leader would come with the Iberian War, which took place in the South Caucasus, not on the Iberian Peninsula as its name might suggest. That would probably be the moment when Justinian and Belisarius met for the first time, forming what would one day become a great friendship. Both were tasked with defeating and achieving victory in the Iberian War against the Sassanid Persians, which proved to be a rather difficult conflict due to the lack of capable men and experienced generals, with Belisarius, although very talented for his age, not being even a shadow of the great general he would one day become. In our timeline, the Byzantines, although better armed and organized, were outnumbered by the Sasanian Persians, with the Byzantines having only about 20 to 30,000 men to wage the war, while the Sasanian Persians had almost double that number, probably numbering between 50 to 60,000 men. In this timeline, after a few months of conflict, Justinian would realize that the way the conflict was evolving, it could last a long time, so he would decide to act, taking initiative and proving his great ability as a leader and reformer despite not being a great military general, sending several recruitment letters throughout the empire to the different groups of secret pagans that he met during his youth, and who swore loyalty to the plan they had to one day end Christian oppression. And he would ask all who could to join the Iberian War against the Sassanid Persians. With that, although Belisarius and other generals would have to train new recruits, the total size of the Byzantine army would increase massively, probably doubling during the second year of the conflict. Justinian in this timeline was extremely educated and familiar with the wars of Rome's glorious past, having studied many books on the strategies and adaptability that Romans had demonstrated centuries before, such as reading Julius Caesar's book The Gallic Wars for giving an example. With all this knowledge, Justinian would adopt the pragmatic mindset of his ancestors to reform the Byzantine army and adapt it to the current situation changing several archaic, limited, or useless military strategies, in addition to modifying and adapting the design of armor shields and weapons to make them more efficient, with the Byzantine soldiers increasingly resembling the Roman legionaries of old. With all these extraordinary ideas and ingenuity that would have been very strange and surprising to Christians, the Iberian War would turn much more quickly in favor of the Byzantines, allowing them to obtain more concessions from the defeated Sassanid Persians and greater control over the South Caucasus kingdoms they were defending. It would also be during this war that Justinian would finally become the new Roman emperor after the death of his uncle Justin, immediately taking advantage of his new powers and resources to progressively begin his reforms that would little by little take away all the privileges and advantages of Christians in the society and politics of the empire. In this timeline, the Iberian War would only last 3 years instead of 6, with the Byzantines being able to impose more conditions on their crushing victory than in our timeline, completely annexing the region that was previously known as Armenia, and even launching a brief invasion on the capital of the Sasanian Persian Empire to force its surrender in the war and extract more concessions from their enemies. After having signed a peace treaty and having received a large amount of gold as compensation, the Byzantines would return to their territory more victorious than ever, with high morale and Roman military vigor recovered after a long time. During that time, the new recruits who were secretly pagans would have acquired a great deal of military experience and would have become familiar with the rest of the Byzantine army, creating a strong cohesion of friendship between the soldiers with the pagans, having secretly, during all this time, the secret mission entrusted to them by Justinian to try to free the minds of the indoctrinated soldiers from the limiting Christian dogmatism, with many having managed to calm the radicalization of the most staunch Christians and others, even having gotten some of them to return to their pagan traditions. Although more than anything, the idea was to create a more open tolerance to religious divergences in the eyes of the Christians without necessarily converting them back to Greco-Roman paganism. Justinian during those conflicts would have created a gigantic loyalty of the soldiers who participated in the Iberian War, especially the pagans, with even Belisarius having a more open point of view on the situation, already knowing that Justinian had abandoned Christianity decades ago since he had his accident that changed his personality and beliefs forever. But Justinian was still the genius and strategist he was in our timeline, and he knew that acting impulsively by creating a general uprising of the pagans against Christian dominance in the empire would be a mistake, and he had to wait for the right moment for that. And during that wait, Justinian would begin to implement all the reforms in law enforcement he would become known for in the future, but this time without limiting or hindering the pagans, and little by little promoting the cultural interest for the Roman people to keep ancient traditions intact, and to have greater tolerance for those who were not Christians, creating enormous resentment and frustration among the elites of Constantinople who were staunch Christians. Justinian would also use the enormous imperial treasury that Emperor Anastasius had raised during his reign with his economic reforms to finance the reconstruction and renovation of several ancient Roman buildings, especially the baths and aqueducts, greatly improving the general hygiene of the Roman people, as well as rebuilding abandoned Roman roads to facilitate travel throughout the empire once again. He would also promote the rediscovery of the scientific and medical knowledge of the ancient Greeks and Romans, as recent data shows that since the Antonine Plague, the Romans never again achieved the level of medical and scientific knowledge they had then, due to the fact that most doctors died from the Antonine Plague trying to save their patients. And Justinian's interest in promoting the study of this ancient knowledge would be very useful for what was to come in a few years, as we all know. With an army largely loyal to Justinian, his popular reforms, the restoration of ancient Roman monuments and amenities such as baths and aqueducts, and the progressive liberation and tolerance of non-Christians, in addition to the return of the study of the ancient medical and scientific knowledge of their ancestors, it could be said that Justinian was progressively initiating a renaissance long before it happened in our timeline. With all of this, there was only one thing left for Justinian's plans to come to fruition, a perfect excuse to change Christian dominance at a political level in the empire. And that event would come with the Nika riots that occurred in our timeline, creating unparalleled chaos throughout Constantinople that would even endanger the integrity of Justinian and his wife Theodora. But here, Justinian was ready. He had been waiting for many decades for the perfect moment to finally act and return the Romans to their former mentality and pragmatism. and having already anticipated that a revolt would eventually occur, whether organized by his Christian enemies or political rivals or by some other random event like the Nika riots, he would have already kept several legions ready around Constantinople and the Bosphorus Strait in general, allowing reinforcements to be received in the face of such chaos very quickly from his loyal soldiers, with many having already reverted to being Hellenistic or Roman pagans, or having accepted classical Roman pragmatism and acceptance and tolerance towards non-Christians. Through the revolt, a gigantic purge would occur as in our timeline, but also taking advantage of the gigantic chaos that this event would cause, Justinian would eliminate all his enemies and political rivals who were opposed to his reforms, and above all, lack of Christian faith. After all this purging, Justinian would completely reorganize his government, assigning administrative positions to rich and competent pagans, and finally being able to have enough power and influence to make Christianity no longer the official religion of the state and of the Roman Empire, returning to implement a policy of tolerance to all cults and religions throughout the empire like in the good old days. In the end, although Justinian's actions were extremely risky and could have cost him dearly had all gone wrong, the outcome would be unquestionable, and the Roman people held Justinian in great esteem as emperor reformer and most of all liberator, with the vast majority being extremely loyal and grateful that Justinian had freed them from Christian tyranny and dogmatism, with many graciously and suddenly revealing hypocritically that during all this time they were always pagans in secret, and that they were only Christians because they were forced to follow that faith and for the benefits it brought them, and not out of genuine conviction. With a reformed, renovated, rebuilt, modernized empire, with a happy and satisfied people, high morale, recovered military vigor, and Roman pragmatism and adaptability rediscovered, in addition to the Persians being unable for the moment to do anything to them due to the tremendous defeat they received during this alternate Iberian War, Justinian would decide that it was time to carry out the final phase of his plan, reconquer the territories of the Western Roman Empire, and reunite the entire empire to restore it to its former glory. He would start by reconquering Africa, a very simple and quick reconquest like in our timeline. And then, subsequently, he would begin his reconquest of Italy and Illyria, taking advantage of the succession crisis that the Ostrogoths were experiencing as in our timeline. Here, with the Roman martial vigor recovered, with the pragmatism and the legendary adaptability of the legionaries rediscovered, in addition to a number of men much higher than in our timeline for being more motivated than ever to fight in order to recover the former territories of the empire by the great promises of rewards and offers of land to the soldiers, as in the old days Italy would be reconquered very quickly with a brutality and masculinity that the effeminate Christian mentality could not have allowed, ironically causing Italy to be much less depopulated than in our timeline, and many deaths to be avoided simply by not having prolonged that conflict against the Ostrogoths for many years. Having killed or expelled all the Germanic barbarians from Italy, the Latin Romans, not tired of decades of constant wars and massacres, would have been much more grateful for the liberation that the Byzantines were providing them, with Justinian also financing large projects of reconstruction throughout the peninsula, especially in major cities like Rome. He would also apply all his reforms and law enforcement that he made in the eastern part of the empire, reenacting the importance of tolerating all religions and cults in that area of the empire as well, and dismantling the influence and power of the Roman Catholic Church, preventing the growing influence that institution would gain in the following centuries. Here, the intention would not only be to purely reconquer the former Roman territories at all costs regardless of the destruction or deaths caused. Justinian also wanted to rebuild, repair, and revive the beauty of the Roman greatness of old, fixing roads, buildings, temples, baths, aqueducts, and rehabilitating pagan academies, putting great emphasis on the education of the youth in the Greco-Roman traditions of antiquity, creating an environment much more grateful and faithful to the authority of Justinian as the Roman emperor. Eventually, even though everything was going well for Justinian, the plague that would bear his name in the future would finally reach his now large empire, creating a tragedy like no other. But in this timeline, Justinian's multiple reforms, his initiatives to rediscover the medical and scientific knowledge of antiquity, and the reconstruction of baths and aqueducts throughout the empire that would provide a certain hygiene and superior quality of life to the plebs, would allow for many more people to survive the Justinian plague. But even with all these conditions far superior to those in our timeline, we have to be realistic here. It would still be a catastrophic event that would deeply affect the population of the Roman Empire, only much less than in our timeline, and fortunately Italy and Illyria were already secured and fully under Byzantine control, which would also greatly help alleviate the losses that would occur in the Roman army. In our timeline, the Justinian plague affected between 15 to 25% of the total population of the Roman Empire, which was composed of between 25 to 30 million inhabitants. In this timeline, the plague would only affect between 10 to 15% of the total population of the Roman Empire, a percentage more similar to the one they had during the Antonine plague in the 2nd century CE. So yes, it would be bad. Very bad, but not as bad as in our timeline, and it wouldn't even come close to leaving the empire so destroyed and depopulated this time around. Eventually, little by little, the population, including Justinian, would begin to recover from the plague, and the plans to restore Rome to its greatness would follow once again. The positive thing about all the reforms and improvements to the quality of life that Justinian implemented in this timeline is that while the plague did not affect them as much as originally, for the rest of the Germanic and Slavic kingdoms, it would not be the same, with those being just as devastated by the plague as in our timeline, having not maintained or rebuilt the Roman infrastructure in their areas which could have improved the quality of life and general hygiene of their population even if only a little. Thanks to that, when the Byzantine Empire will eventually recover sufficiently from the plague and rebuild its army, they could continue with their ambitions of reconquest. Just like in our timeline, they would take advantage of the chaos and instability in which the Visigothic kingdom found itself in order to reconquer Hispania, but this time, with all the reforms, martial vigor, and Roman pragmatic mentality recovered, the reconquest of Hispania would be total and absolute, destroying all Visigothic influence in the area, killing its nobles, capturing and enslaving the rest who would not surrender, and assimilating those who were completely Romanized over the decades, reapplying all the reforms, applications of laws, and benefits to that reconquered province, just as Justinian did in other parts of the empire. By that point, Justinian was very old, and he knew his days were numbered, but despite this, he would continue believing in his dream, in the dream of one day restoring the Roman Empire to its former glory, beginning the final conquest of his reign, that reconquest being southern Gaul, wanting once again to reconnect Hispania and Italy to facilitate the total control of the Mediterranean. The war between the Franks and the Romans would be very intense and brutal, as they were the most advanced and organized Germanic barbarians, but even so, they would still be recovering from the Justinian plague that affected them much more than the Byzantines of this timeline, and also their control over the territory of southern Gaul was not as strong as in the northern area of Gaul, and eventually a surrender agreement would be signed with the Byzantines to return the entire southern coast of Gaul to connect Hispania with Italy, with the Franks unable to compete with the organization and power of the Roman army, having recovered their vigor and martial discipline of the old days, once again being a powerful, intimidating, and unstoppable force. And with that, finally, the Romans would once again become the masters of the Mediterranean, with the honor and greatness of that empire restored, and with the barbarians realizing that the true Roman Empire had returned, and that their days occupying their former territories were numbered. Shortly after that final victory, Justinian would die around the same time as in our timeline, but not before having chosen and adopted the ideal successor, probably being a young man who would have grown up during Justinian's reign, having assimilated and recovered the pagan Greco-Roman spirit and mentality that his ancestors had lost with Christian dominance, being a Neoplatonist who would follow Justinian's intentions, desires, and ambitions. And although at the end of his reign, not all the territories lost decades ago were reconquered, if Justinian's successor is even half competent as emperor than what Justinian was, then the future of the Romans will be assured, and finally, after centuries of constant decline, since the death of Marcus Aurelius and the end of the Pax Romana, it could be said that at last the Roman Empire was going to enter a new golden age. What was in our timeline only the remnants of what was once the greatest power in history up to that point would remain here as the main and dominant power of the Western world, thus allowing Rome to truly be eternal. And with that, I think this is a good moment to end this video. I hope you enjoyed this story. Don't forget to subscribe, like the video, and comment on what you thought of it. And without anything else to say, see you next time.